But first and foremost, it's here on Spreecast, the college football show. Dan Strapper, Joe DeSalvo from the CFF site, and Ben Pritchett from FantasyInsiders.com, our lead college football writer, all here to talk yet another week of college football. And Ben, I guess we start at the beginning, and we talk about injuries often. We'll get into individual position plays, but this has been a pretty crazy week with the whole Josh Doctson situation down there in Texas. Latest we've heard is Doctson is probable, will play according to his coach, but you feel slightly differently about what will actually transpire on Saturday.
No, I think he'll play. I think he'll live up to that, possibly. College football, you deal with a lot of coaches speak and a lot of lying, and this might be definitely a lying type situation because you had I think he was a radio host come out and tweet that Doctson was going to be out for the season, then had to back off of that, and then Patterson came out and said he was going to be probable, and then he actually had to confirm it and confirmed it on Twitter actually. So I'm not sure what's going on with this situation. I'm guarantee you he has a wrist issue, and I guarantee you that he'll be very affected by this. And I actually think with this game getting out of hand very early, I doubt he sees much action or targets. But he definitely will see something, but I doubt it'll be anything. I think it actually helps drive down ownership of some of the other receivers for TCU, and might actually drive Doctson's ownership up, and that's good for us because if you just don't need to own him, you need to let other people own him.
Joe, thoughts on one Doctson and also other injury news and news from this past week we need to be keeping an eye on?
Yeah, I think Ben had a good point. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that Patterson was so adamant on Twitter that it made it seem like it was a no-brainer that he was going to play. And I think had he been downplayed it a little bit, I'd have been, I don't know, maybe there's a little something to it. Maybe there's a chess match going on. But the one thing to keep in mind, like Ben said, they're playing Kansas as well, right? Look at the matchup that they have. There's no reason for him to play if they're going to need him down the line. But you know what? We were just talking about Juju Smith-Schuster last week with USC undergoing surgery on his hand. He puts a cast on and goes out and has a hell of a game last week over at USC. So the bar has been raised now to play with an injury. So you've got Josh Doctson with TCU, and I think the other maybe significant injury right now is when you're looking at maybe CJ Prosise, the running back at Notre Dame, as far as trying to figure out what's going on with him. I would say those are the two biggies this week.
And what about over-unders? Are there specific lines that you've kept an eye on as you're writing the early slate and ones that stand out as potential gold mines for some plays this Saturday?
Yeah, the biggest over and unders when I wrote them all down, they're always constantly changing, but the biggest over unders, you've got 5 games over 60 points, a few hovering around the 59 totals, but TCU Kansas obviously is a 70-point game, but with TCU favored by 45, it has blowout potential all over it. I don't have a problem rostering players from blowout games as long as you focus on the right kinds of players like an Aaron Green or something like that. But that game has a high total. I like you have Kansas State, Texas Tech, which is going to be a high-scoring game, should be a high-scoring game. North Carolina, Miami at 64. The sneaky game that is going to get overlooked because for the people that play on DraftKings, but got added for us on FanDuel if you play a lot there, is the Navy SMU game, and that's a 63-point game with Navy favored by 3 touchdowns. Navy's playing great football, and we'll get into some of those plays there, but there's some juicy ones in that one. And I think the last one you want to hit on is probably the Oklahoma State-Iowa State game, which that one's going to be the hard one to peg. There's a lot of moving parts on both those teams to actually nail down the right plays in those games is going to be difficult. There's a couple of obvious receivers, but beyond that, it's really difficult. But
now, Joe, we get the change back at a variety of schools where we're moving quarterbacks, we're moving wide receivers up and down depth charts. Are there any changes this week that you're keeping an eye on outside of injuries, but talking about depth chart changes, guys who have made impressions as the season's gone on that you think are viable as options as we get ready to start talking position by position?
I think at this point, at this stage of the game, you've got to go with Old Faithful, and there's not a lot of changes going on the rosters right now. I think one significant change that may go on would be back at Iowa, where it looks like Jordan Canzeri is going to step back into the fold there. So from a depth chart standpoint, I don't think there's going to be a lot of changes going into this week. And as far as injuries go, depth chart changes. There's not a lot going on this week. I think we stay with the usual. We go with what we know and play the matchups.
And let's start at quarterback, where obviously the Doxson news and the matchup will affect Boykin in some way, shape, or form. There are other talented receivers on that roster who will also be of value. But where are you looking at quarterback? Do you like Boykin despite his top receiver being a little bit limited? JT Barrett should be back as he's practiced all week. Who is your top quarterback option as we head into this weekend?
I think that what you're going to get with Boykin, and it's a little different. And I think we actually did see that when Doxson went down than what you saw earlier in the year when he was throwing for a lot of yardage and a lot of touchdowns. I think you're going to see Boykin maybe run a little bit more. I also think they're going to blow him out. So it's tough to spend the kind of money that you have to on Boykin with all the other quarterbacking options out there on this slate, especially in the top tier. There's a couple great ones for FanDuel in the mid tier too. So it's not really a play you need to go out of your way to make, but he's definitely going to get his points in whatever way that he can. I would rather go for like a Mahomes or a Deshaun Watson if you're going to spend money. I love Watson at Syracuse. Syracuse just gave up 363 yards and 3 touchdowns to Kyle Bolin last game out. That's Kyle Bolin with Louisville, who is losing his job to Jackson. So I really don't see a whole lot. I mean, if you can go back farther on Syracuse. They were torched by Sean McGuire. They were even torched by Quentin Flowers. You're talking about guys that really don't throw. And Flowers can run, and Jackson can run for Louisville, but they didn't even have those guys. So it's interesting to see with Watson how many points he'll get before he gets pulled and before this thing gets out of hand. But I love him in the matchup for the way he's been running. Last 3 games he's rushed for over 90 yards. So I love that matchup. And then Texas Tech, he's been drawing me in every time. Mahomes is every single time against Kansas State. This is a high total game. His price is a little bit cheaper than the other guys, so I really like him. Deshaun Kaiser against Wake, especially if Procise is out. Kaiser threw for 5 touchdowns and rushed for another in the last game with Procise went out in the first quarter. So you got to think that they're going to lean heavier on him if Procise is out. So definitely one to watch. My favorite quarterback is going to be Keenan Reynolds for FanDuel. Don't know what they were doing with putting Reynolds at 7,100 on FanDuel. He's a guy chasing a touchdown record, facing one of the worst run defenses in college football. I don't know how you approach a lineup, especially a cash game lineup, without starting with Keenan Reynolds. Because even though he's been a little inconsistent with his touchdown production, he's a guy that has 5 touchdown upside rushing the football. There isn't another quarterback that has the kind of ceiling going into a game that Reynolds does going into this one, and he's only 7,100. So he lets you open up your checkbook to buy some expensive receivers and some expensive running backs. So I love him. Connor Cook, Joe Huebner, I love a lot for Kansas State against that Texas Tech run defense. It's allowing 260 yards per game on the ground. Rudock has some upside. I think Hills is the sneakiest play of all because you initially look at Michigan State's run defense and you think that they can't that he's not going to be able to run the football. But if you look at the last few games that he's had 100 plus rushing yards in, they were against Penn State, Iowa, and Ohio State. All good run defenses, and he rushed for over 100 yards against each of those. Even if this game gets out of hand, he has a little bit of potential, especially with Michigan State's lackluster pass defense. And then my last sneaky one I'm going to throw in, I think I've hit on all my guys. I usually don't do this, but Parker Bohm, if we have Thomas Sirk go out, Parker Bohm is 4K. He's a Tim Tebow like Sirk. He's this year's Sirk, like Sirk was last year for Boone. He has that ability to run. He's shown the ability in the games this year. He played in the Miami game. He's played in some big matchups. He's only 4K. He's minimum price as a quarterback. And on DraftKings, that's going to open up a lot of salary, which you need to do because they're so tight this week. They loosened up last week, but they've tightened way back up this week. So he's a great GPP play if, in fact, it is confirmed that Cirque is out. Pittsburgh has had some struggles with running quarterbacks in the last few games. So I'm watching that one. I don't know if I have the guts to do it in cash, but it's definitely an interesting play.
I don't know that I've made a Cirque du Soleil joke this season. I'll probably have to hold on to that for a different time. Wasn't prepared for it.
My daughter. You know my daughter's name's Soleil, right?
I did not. After Punky Brewster?
Well, yeah. It was more so not after Punky Brewster, but hey, we're watching VH1 Behind the Music. That's a cool name. Soleil. There you go. That's how it happened.
It's amazing that now Soleil Moonfire, the name Soleil, which I didn't know your daughter was named, has made 2 different appearances on Fantasy Insider's podcasts or shows, as Davis and I brought up Soleil Moonfire the other day. So, though I think Davis was like 2 when Punky Brewster was out. So, Joe, moving over to you on that awkward transition. What quarterback option?
Well, look, it's not really an awkward transition. I mean, Ben basically covered every game on the slate, so he didn't leave me with.
Hey, turnabout's fair play, brother.
So I hear you, man. Look, here's the deal. So I'll just reiterate a couple of names that you threw out there because there's 2 that I did write down specifically. Keenan Reynolds on FanDuel, I wrote him down, so I'm glad you touched on him. I think it's a no-brainer at 7,100. And Joe Huebner, I have him on DraftKings and FanDuel. I think that's a good shot right there against Texas Tech. I will say at the top, I don't know. I'm not, even without Josh Doxson, I'm not sure Boykin is a bad play. I think you're right. Look, there's one word to keep in mind, even when we're talking about Trevone Boykin, Heisman, right? So I still think that there's a lot of potential there for padded stats this week. And remember, JT Barrett comes back. He's got a great matchup against Illinois. That was one you didn't touch on yet. And look, Marquise Williams over at North Carolina is as hot as almost any quarterback in the country right now. So when you get past Boykin on DraftKings at 10K, you've got Watson, Barrett, Mahomes, Williams right there in that 87 to 8,400 range that all could be interchangeable, and I think are all solid plays this week.
Ben, let's transition over to running back. And are you chasing that over-under with, not you specifically, but would you suggest chasing that over-under UNC and Miami? You get a little bit of a salary relief with Elijah Hood down at 6,600 on DraftKings. Is he an option or one of your top options, I should ask, on a slate with such a high over-under?
I am such a huge fan of Elijah Hood. I really am. I think he's a terrific running back. I think he'll be terrific going forward. It's just one of those guys that I don't trust. I think he's a very skilled player, but I don't trust North Carolina to use him properly. They are giving him more touches around the goal lines. He is getting touchdowns, which is great and increases his value tremendously. But he's priced right there with, he's more expensive than Kelvin Taylor against South Carolina. He's right there with Aaron Green. He's more expensive than DeAndre Washington against Kansas State. Those are guys that I would actually say are better options. I would even say Wayne Gallman's a better option for Clemson. So it's tough to say that he's a guy I would look at if when you read the write-up, he's not going to be on there. So I guess I'm looking a different direction.
And what direction would that be?
Well, good lead-in. Thank you. I like Derrick Henry. If you're looking to spend, I think he's better play on FanDuel. We've talked about this before. So whenever you read my write-ups and you see expensive running backs, they usually aren't for DraftKings. They're going to get DraftKings salaries listed, but that doesn't mean you need to be using them. Unless you're running out a lineup that has like a Perry Hills and a Joe Huebner on DraftKings, you're not going to be rostering very many expensive running backs. It's just not going to happen. But I love Derrick Henry. He's gotten 30 carries a game over his last 5, hit 200-yard mark in 2 of his last 3 games, including a game over LSU's run defense. Not worried about Mississippi State's run defense. I mean, it's not bad, but it's not one that Derrick Henry can't run all over. And they've shown that they're going to just ride him. And he's a back that can take the punishment. So as long as he doesn't get hurt, he's a great option for touchdowns. He's a great option for running the football. Fun fact, Alabama hasn't thrown for a touchdown pass in the last 3 games. So they aren't looking for it. They're undefeated in those three. They're just looking to run the ball with Henry. And I'm fine with that. And he's priced at 8,900. He's cheaper than Elliott. Elliott's run for 100 yards in every game this season. He's a great option against Illinois. We talked about Gallman and Washington and Green. Those are all games that are going to have high points. And they have their focal points of their offenses when they run the football. So I like all those guys. Kelvin Taylor, Sony Michel, against Auburn's run defense, it's allowing 191 yards per game on the ground and 4.8 yards per carry. It's almost as bad as the Kentucky defense that he rushed for 165 yards and a touchdown against last week with a broken hand. I'm not brave enough to make this play, and I wasn't brave enough to do it last week, and I'm a Georgia fan. As seeing the way they've struggled and seeing the way they've had bad quarterback play, I can't do it. But he's only 6,800 on FanDuel, which is a lot cheaper than some of the other guys. I would probably rather go with Kelvin Taylor, or if for some crazy reason you're fading Keenan Reynolds, Chris Swain has been really good lately. He's only 6,100 on FanDuel, which is what used to be the minimum price there. But this week they have just done an egregious flip to soft salaries that you really have extremely good players priced way under what they should be. Swain is an example of that. Joseph Yearby's a great example of that for Miami and that high total you were just talking about. You know, if you're thinking about going after that game total, I would advise you to look more towards Yearby than Hood, who's only 5,500. That's like a punt price. That is a sick price. But my best value, my must play on this whole slate is on DraftKings, and it's Charles Jones, who's only 4,100. Texas Tech is allowing 270 yards per game on the ground. Huebner's going to get his running attempts, but Jones has gotten plenty of running attempts lately, as in the last two games, and he had 14 touchdowns last season. He's not a guy that can't. I shouldn't say he's a guy that can definitely score touchdowns. He can carry the rock and relieve some of the stress off of Huebner as they obviously are trying to run the football way more than they're trying to pass. Wes Brown's minimum price against Michigan State. That's a terrible matchup, but he's $3K on DraftKings. And sometimes those are the guys that you just have to plug and play.
Fill out your roster with 1 or 2 3K guys to get yourself the other options. Now, Joe, as we look at running backs, you mentioned the injury earlier. Where are you looking from either playoff or season long, or what you're doing from a rankings perspective over on the CFF site? Who are your top 3 or 4 running backs who you'd be willing to pay for on this slate?
Well, I think Ben hit it on the head. I think you ride the Derrick Henry wave. I think when a player, I mean, look, we've seen it all year, earlier in the year with Seth Russell at quarterback, the receivers, Coleman, Doxson, Boykin over at TCU. When you get these A1 players that are just putting up ungodly stats, you've got to ride the wave. Dalvin Cook until his injury, and he's the high priced right now on the FanDuel this week. But I think Derrick Henry right now to be the third priced running back is the way to go there on FanDuel. I like him as my top option. You know, you threw out Wayne Gallman on DraftKings. I like him at 6,500. Kelvin Taylor, 64 on FanDuel. I think Josh Adams, you got to watch the CJ Prosise situation at Notre Dame, because at 5,900 DraftKings and 63 on FanDuel, that's in play if he's all of a sudden the starter now. And you know what? Aaron Green over there at TCU, we know Kansas defense is just terrible. So for 6,200 on DraftKings, I think he's worth a play. And look, here's another name too, guys, because we talked about Peyton Barber so much in the beginning of the year over at Auburn, but Jovan Robinson right now is carrying the rock. I mean, Barber seems to be banged up. So to get him for 4,700 on DraftKings or 5K over on FanDuel versus Georgia, I think is a good deal. I have Charles Jones, Ben. I think you hit that one on the head. For 4,100 DraftKings, I think that's a no-brainer. And then another one, another situation that bears watching as well. We've seen Madre London go down at Michigan State. LJ Scott's beat up, and right now it seems like Gerald Holmes is getting the first crack. Right now he's 5K on both sites, and I think that's a great value play this week for Michigan State going against Maryland.
Tons of options, it seems, and Ben, you made the mention of the flip in pricing to a certain extent, and it's really interesting also the difference between DraftKings pricing for college football and DraftKings pricing for NFL, what position they seem to target more. It feels as though they overprice quarterbacks on DraftKings and underprice running backs a lot of the time. And here you sort of see where you get a middle ground of a mixed bag, as you said, also of some of these running backs being a bit too expensive to work into your lineups. But At times we do have to pay up to get the best value, or I should say the best output, not the best value. If you are focusing on one thing this weekend, Ben, for running backs, are you constructing 4 cheaper end options? You mentioned a couple of guys who are sub 5K as potential options. Is that the position to get value out of this week, or do you see a difference in wide receiver, which we're about to get to, where you can go cheap there as well?
Yeah, it's one of those weeks where there's not a lot of like super cheap options, like period. Even at the wide receiver position on DraftKings. So like you're going to be floating 4K guys, like 4-1, like Charles Jones and some receivers, which we'll get into later, but they're like all at the 42, 43. There's a few like 39. I found one 3,400, but like for the most part, unless you're throwing a tight end in there, and even the tight ends are high priced. I mean, Jalen Samuels as a tight end play on DraftKings is 4,900 or something like that, which is fine because he's superstar, but like that's what you're dealing with, really, really tight salaries. So it's going to be tough to put something together. You would argue, and I don't know necessarily because I don't play a whole lot of cash games. I play a lot of GPPs, right. So I can't really testify to this, but it seems to benefit the person who knows a lot and knows what they're doing. DraftKings seems to be going after that guy, whereas FanDuel is going after the novice player that's just throwing together guys that he's heard of, because you can easily do that on FanDuel. You can't do that on DraftKings. You have to dig.
You can piece together the name guys. Yeah.
You do, and you're not going to be able to do 9K running backs if you spend on, say you spend on one of your quarterbacks, you go Joe Huebner as your second quarterback. You grab some running backs, you start with Charles Jones. Maybe you throw in, let's see, who's a cheap option? Maybe Kelvin Taylor at 6,100. That's about as cheap as they get on running backs, unless you're willing to take a risk on a Nixon or a Brown. Nixon being the TCU wide receiver that's listed as a running back, who really stepped it up when Doxson went down. He actually is 4,500 on DraftKings, which is, I guess, sort of cheap. But it's going to be a lot of receivers. That's what you're going to have to do with the full point PPR. If you're going to want to win a GPP, you're going to have to find the value guys, the 5K, 4,700 guys like Alan Lazard and Ridley and things like that.
Joe, I'm going to give you first take on wide receivers, as Ben has been more than comprehensive over quarterbacks and running backs. We'll give Ben a small break here, and he can fill in the blanks on wide receiver on this early slate. As always, we're going to touch on late slate ever so lightly at the end of tonight's Spreecast, and we'll have Joe's start sit at the end as well, and we'll close it out with a Ben hot take as well. But Joe, if you don't mind, some of your top options at the wide out position here on this early slate.
Well, look, you got Josh Doxson, okay, and we talked about consistency all year, but I think right now, we talked about at the top of the show, there's just too many questions surrounding his availability and if he plays. I mean, look, TCU, there's no shortage of weapons out there. You still got Turpin, you still got Lissaby, who are good, solid options, whether or not Doxson plays or not, given their price. So I think those are the guys you're looking at this week. To me, the best receiver on the board this week from a consistency standpoint, I think you look at Aaron Burbridge at Michigan State for what he's done over the recent weeks for 7,500 right now. If I'm looking at a top receiver in those first half dozen guys, that's the one I'm targeting this week. I'm going with Burbridge. And you know what? I even have McGarrett King circled down there at 3,900 on DraftKings. This could be a good week to maybe go with a Michigan State stack over at wide receiver. And you know, I've got McGarrett King's at 3,900. We have talked about Ridley in the past. I mean, look, Derrick Henry's been doing so much. I think it's only a matter of time before Alabama throws another touchdown. I think it's a Ridley week again. For getting him at around 5K on both sites, I think is good value. And, you know, a couple of more names I'll throw out there this week. I think Amara Darboh at Michigan this week at 4,800, if you're looking for an option at receiver for that price, could be a good sneaky play this week. And Deion Kane at Clemson for 4,200 going against Syracuse, I think is a really good option this week.
Ben, where do we fill in the gaps here? Are there names that you have ready to rock and roll that Joe did not touch on?
You know what? I'm going to make people, since I'm giving out a lot of plays, I'm going to make people kind of go to the article for some of these. But I will say, as a high price guy, I'll give you my number one high price guy. It's Will Fuller. Got back on the wagon last week with 152 yards and 3 touchdowns. He's got a touchdown in every game except for the game against Clemson, which they lost. I like him a lot in this matchup against Wake because I think that at 7,300 on FanDuel, he's a little bit cheaper than Grant and Burbridge, who I like both those guys. But he's a guy that I feel like could really feature like he did last week. Grant's great at home. We're not going to get into those guys, but James Washington's probably my top mid-tier guy. Been freaking phenomenal over the last few weeks. He's had over 100 yards in four of his last 5 games. And how many touchdowns? That's at 7 touchdowns. 7 touchdowns in his last 4 games. That's insane. Like for an offense that predicates itself on so many different factors and they can't run the ball, for Washington to shine like that just goes to show how good he is. And he's really made Brandon Shepard just I was a Brandon Shepard fan. I don't even know who he is anymore. Like I don't even look at him anymore. So and Washington's done that to him. Well, he's just so good. He's a big play threat. He's just been great. But we'll focus on the cheap price guys because I think these are the guys you're going to want to have. These are the guys that are going to be crucial as you build your lineups. I think Artavis Scott for Clemson against Syracuse at only 5,300 on FanDuel is a bargain. It's such a bargain that like DraftKings has him at 6,200. That's like a huge difference in price because 6,200 on DraftKings is like the equivalent of Jakeem Grant and Tyler Boyd, and yet he is 5,300 on FanDuel, which is only 800 above the minimum. That's a lock-in price. You're 72 targets, 40% more than any other receiver on his team. Like, I don't understand, even in a matchup where it wasn't good, but this is a good matchup, but even in a bad matchup, he's a guy I'm probably forcing in. He hasn't been consistent, but it's not necessarily his fault. It's more of how the offense has flown. They just kind of done what's worked. And Watson does a really good job of running when he needs to and spreading the ball out when he needs to. He's a really good quarterback. He's like a Cam Newton type quarterback. I think he's going to be a phenomenal pro one day. I just think the world of him. But he doesn't focus in on Artavis Scott, and that hurts Scott sometimes. But the fact that Scott has so many targets, I'm feel safe running him out at 5,300. Ridley, he talked about, totally agree with that. He's so due. We don't like using the word due in the daily fantasy world, in the statistical world, but he is. I mean, he's a guy that has 7 touchdowns pardon me, 7 catches in each of his last 4 games. So he's a definite threat to score. He's going to score when Alabama actually chooses to pass for touchdowns. I like Lazard. I love Turpin, who he brought up. This isn't my hot take, but a guy that could be a hot take is Kermit Whitfield for Florida State. I know Joe was all up on him when he was catching fire, and he was right. As Golson was getting very comfortable with Whitfield, he was just having these monster games for super cheap prices. Well, he's facing NC State. He's back to being super cheap. He's only 4,300 on DraftKings. He's 4,500 on FanDuel. And he disappeared the last 2 weeks because McGuire was quarterbacking. Well, Golson's confirmed starter. So what better way to welcome Whitfield back if you want to play the hot take and think he has chemistry with Golson? Well, this looks like a great opportunity for him to bust back out. That's a little crazy, but I think it's possible. It's very possible. Deion Kane, who Joe brought up, is an insane value at 4,200 and 4,500 on FanDuel. We're talking about a guy who he missed a game because he was benched because of an attitude adjustment. So says Dabo. But all the other games in the last 4, he's been tremendous. He has 2 games where he scored a touchdown. The other 2, he went for over 90 yards. Big play threat in every single game. Sadler's becoming the guy for Mahomes in a targeted fashion. We're not going to give up anybody else. That's it. You're done.
What's funny is you mentioned Ridley with the due, and that we don't like to talk about due. You know, the word that will be thrown out there is regression, and regression back to the mean, and regression back to scoring touchdowns.
Yeah, that's fancy. Fancy talk for due.
But that's exactly, and that's what I think so funny about statistics in general is, we don't talk about being due, but yet you say he'll regress back to the mean of how many touchdowns he scores year over year, and it means he's due. It means he has to score those touchdowns if he's going to regress back to his season average. That's just my opinion. Anyway, very, very in-depth breakdown, guys, and I think you both threw out a lot of names that are value names too, and that's the big thing I found in college football. If you can get maybe not the min-sal punt, but those guys in that 4K range and $4,500 who give you upside potential of the higher price guys, you're going to be in really good shape in cash games, and especially if you nail all of them in GPPs as well. Ben, what about tight ends? Are we in a price point with FanDuel that we still have cheap 2K guys, or are we looking to spend $4,000 on them?
Okay, so this may be the most complicated decision you have to make. I mean, we've talked about some obvious plays. Tight ends is going to be complicated. It really is. Joe loves to bring up Leggett, and Leggett I haven't given a lot of attention to. If you've read my write-ups, he doesn't make it into a lot of write-ups, but Joe's been completely right about him. He's actually, if you go by lately how he's been performing, he's become like the number 1-2 option in the passing game, right up there with Scott and right up there with Deion Kane. So he has a great upside in this matchup. He's 3,800, not necessarily a guy I go out of my way to pay up for, but I can't disregard him anymore. He's just become so crucial to Clemson as a pass catching option, and he's been great. And I can't hold him back. I like Butt against Indiana in a game where they should be able to throw again. Rudock was able to throw for 330-something yards. I think it was 337 against Rutgers last week. Not saying he does that against Indiana, but Indiana's giving up 330 yards per game through the air. So even if he throws for 250 or so, Butt eclipsed 100 yards last week. So he's definitely a guy that could pay off really easily a 3,300 price tag. Like McGee, Greenwich is my cheap play. As they've moved Jalen Samuels around, Greenwich had a good game 2 games ago, didn't do anything last week. He had actually a crucial drop. But he's 2K, so for a minimum price guy, if he's getting like 4 targets with Samuels moving more towards a running back role, that's a great punt. Is just a pure punt. Avery Edwards from Maryland's also 2K. He gets a few targets a game. He's another guy as a true punt at 2K. Michigan State is a weak pass defense. And Perry Hills isn't a good thrower, but that's an option. Jalen Samuels is the guy we want to talk about. I'm probably going to let Joe hammer on him more than I will, but with the injuries to their running back and Shad Thornton leaving, Days being injured, Samuels has got 8 carries last week. He's going to be featured in a rushing role. He's going to be featured in a slot role. He's going to touch the ball 15 to 20 times a game, whether it be through catches, whether it be through running. He has maybe I'm digging a little too deep, but Joe, stop me here in a second. Actually, don't stop me. But here's
the only thing. Here's the only thing about paying up for Samuels this week, and this is what I don't like, is I just don't like the matchup. I don't like Florida State because I don't know how much he's going to be able to do in the running game anyway. And I've been on Samuels all year. I love the fact that you get the dual touch ability from him, from a dual touch running and receiving. I just don't know how much damage he's going to be able to do on the ground this week. The only reason I've been on Leggett week after week after week, he hasn't been racking up a ton of catches, but he's consistently getting it in the end zone for you. And something you touched on at the beginning of the year is look, some of these guys, if you can just get a touchdown from them every week, sometimes the receptions and the yards are just icing on top of the cake. So I don't know. I mean, look, if you want to get a good solid tight end this week, you have to pay up for Samuels because there's just nothing else on the board. I mean, maybe Perkins for Washington this week, and maybe you take a chance with Butt for Michigan just because they're playing Indiana. But all those names we threw out, none of them, all of them, pale in comparison to Jalen Samuels. And if you're just looking from a sheer value per touch standpoint, he's the play. But you've got to pay up $1,800 more than your next best option. And if you need the room to build your lineup, you can't go with Samuels unless you're going cheap somewhere else.
Well, he's priced like.
Yes.
Okay, yes, you must recognize me. I'm already on a different page. He's more expensive than Ridley. He's more expensive than Lazard. He's more expensive than Artavis Scott, all on FanDuel. He's cheaper than those guys on DraftKings. So there's like an element of I could probably play him more on DraftKings than on FanDuel. And here's an important stat to bring up on Jalen Samuels. He's caught, when balls are thrown to him, he has an 85% completion rate. That's insane. He has, how many touchdowns does he have? It's insane how many touchdowns he has. I wish I had it's 12 touchdowns, 5 receiving, 7 rushing. For a tight end to already have 12 touchdowns, that's crazy. NC State's going to score a little bit. They have to. Florida State's not going to shut them out. Samuels is the whole way of they score the football now. He has to be days in around. So there's a element where he's like a definitely going to score touchdown play. So that can be my hot take of the week, is that we definitely see Samuel score touchdowns. Is that hot? Is that hot enough? It's not very hot.
That's hot. I think it's hot against Florida State. That's hot.
So Joe, I'm going to pose this question to you because Ben said they're dead to him. Shorts or Sills, better value on DraftKings? From Steve, he says he spent hours trying to make this choice. Ben's response was that those guys are dead to me, which is a reasonable response with both of those players, as I know Sills and Steve responded with, did kill him last week, killed a lot of lineups last week. But if you had to choose between the two, which do you prefer and why?
Sills and who else?
Duck Hill Shorts.
Look, you're talking to someone that has Shelton Gibson in season long too, who absolutely just did a magic act and disappeared last week. I right now, I mean, you got White that's in the mix now. I don't even know what's going on at West Virginia. I'm staying away from all of them. I agree with Ben. They're a ghost to me.
So find somebody else is the answer. Let's stay
ask
away
us
from
those questions. I'm a little heated about David Sills. He killed a really good lineup of mine last week by
we like giving out good picks. Okay, so we're staying away from Sills this week.
And you know what you just did? What we just did is we just made David Sills go over 100 yards in a touchdown right now. That just happened.
Yeah, there's going to be probably 2 TDs, 125 yards, and some sort of random acrobatic catch on one of those touchdowns that will be talked about and played on loop on SportsCenter, so you can't avoid it in any way, shape, or form. Not that I've watched SportsCenter in the last 5 years, but pop culture reference made sense there. Ben, late slate. I know you're still in the midst of writing the early slate. We don't need to get too in-depth here. We do have Joe's start-sit to come. And we have your hot take, which you can stay with the hot take you had, or we can have a different one later on. That's fine. But if you're building a core of players for the late slate, who are you building around?
Okay, well, we have the fun games in the late slate, which I'm sad that I haven't gotten to dig into it the way I would like to. I've looked at it, but just as surface level, we have, like, FanDuel alone has, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 games of over 60 points, and 7 if you include the 59.5 game of Oregon State at Cal. So they only have 2 games of under 60 point totals. That's a lot. I mean, you didn't even have anywhere close to that in the early slate, and there was a ton more games. So this is the fun slate. You got Memphis, Houston, 71 point total. Tulsa, Cincy, 76.5. Oregon, Stanford's a fun one, 69. And then, of course, the game everybody's going to be watching. I know I'm going to be watching it. Oklahoma at Baylor, 76 point total. That's a fun one. That's going to be a hard one to predict. And the challenge is going to be finding the right elements in all these games, the Houston-Memphis game included, the right cogs that are going to score the touchdowns, that are going to score all the points. I'm going to be just surface level looking at some of the matchups. I'm going to be looking at guys like a Greg Ward on FanDuel, where he's only 9,000. That's really good. Gunnar Kiel has a lot of value facing off against Tulsa. 8,900 on FanDuel. Love him, and I love him for his upside of a lot of touchdown passes. He's not got the running upside that some of these other guys have, but against Tulsa, he doesn't have to do a whole lot to be awesome. They're just that pathetic. So it's definitely one I'll be watching. They're favored by almost 18 points, which goes to show you how bad Tulsa's defense is, considering that they're so potent at times on offense. But that also goes to show you how bad Dane Evans is. And if you roster Dane Evans, hey, if you roster Dane Evans at this point, you have been warned. You may get it. He may be great. Good for you. But if you're running him out on cash games, hey, and he doesn't do anything, it's not my fault.
Hey, Ben, let me tease this out there. Dane Evans, the last good game he had was the week that we suggested benching him about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And we've got something coming up on Start Bench that has Dane Evans in it.
I've got a feeling he's going to be on the start list, and don't do it, guys. Don't do it. Don't do it. Seriously.
Joe, anybody for you in this late slate that you would build and construct a lineup around? Ben touched on.
I couldn't agree with Ben more. There are so many fun plays in this, and I'll just give a 3 or 4 takes on this late slate. I'm at Stidham to be 7,800. I don't care if they're playing Oklahoma. I'm taking him this week. He's not even up there as the high priced guy. I'm liking him. I think McNichols at 7,600 on DraftKings is just stupidly priced. I think you gotta take him playing New Mexico. And look, somebody asked me this last week in season long leagues, you got Coleman, you got KD Cannon. I said sometimes when there's a quarterback change, there could be something that you see. I really like KD Cannon, and I do. I like him this week on both sites at 5,100 and 5,400. Sometimes the rapport is just different between receivers and quarterbacks, so I do like Cannon with Stidham so far. And one more name, and I'll throw out there. I'll let Ben bring it home on this, but watch out for Paul Harris over there at Hawaii at 4,500 versus Fresno State this week.
You got a nod and a possible affirmation there. I don't know what that reaction from Ben was.
He did run for 190 yards last week against UNLV, so I can't really say much. He did lose 2 fumbles, though. I'd bench him for that.
Yeah, he did. Yep.
Coach Ben.
There's a lot of names on this slate I could throw out, but I'm gonna let you save them for the article.
Here's the thing. It's important for people to pay attention to slates, and I haven't started to write this one, so I got to be honest. I don't know how I'm going to break it down, but I do know my initial look at the slate was, how am I going to bridge FanDuel and DraftKings with the way they have these set up? FanDuel has the good games. It has good games in it, but it has a much smaller slate than DraftKings, because DraftKings chose to throw in all the Mountain West games. They just said, hey, we love Mountain West. We're going to throw them all in, and we're going to make you make decisions with them, which I'm perfectly fine with. I love the Mountain West. FanDuel used to do this with their late slate. Loved it. I think that's what always gave you the edge on FanDuel last year, was with these random games where you got to run a Martese Waller against a Hawaii defense that's given up 280 yards on the ground. That's when you get to dive into really good plays that most other people have never heard of. So now it's DraftKings. And so that throws me off. It just really wrecks my rhythm. But they have the UNLV Colorado State game. They have Temple, South Florida, BYU, Mizzou, New Mexico, Boise. We're just going to run them all. Wyoming, San Diego State, and Fresno, Hawaii. All those are games unique to DraftKings. So your roster construction is going to be completely different than your FanDuel construction. So when you read my write-up and when you read Joe's takes, you need to make sure that you're being very specific to the site that you're playing on. And I'm going to try to do my best, but they really deserve 2 separate write-ups, because it's that crucial to get these Mountain West guys in. Like a guy like Rashard Higgins, who hasn't done anything all year, faces off against UNLV. That's a game he could be good in. They have the worst pass defense in the Mountain West. It's a game where he could really thrive in. He's a superstar kind of quarterback, wide receiver that has a bad quarterback. So I actually think he could be very, very sneaky as a play, even at 6,400. But that's the kind of plays that you're going to have to be on that you're not going to get the chance to use on FanDuel.
Hey, well, look, also this, Ben, staying with that game real quick, I'll throw a name while you're at that game, and you got to remember Jason Oden's banged up, and so they've been leaning on the run because of the pass game. You got a guy like Izzy Matthews, who had 16 rushing attempts, scored 2 touchdowns last week. They play UNLV, and he's only 3,400 in DraftKings this week.
Lots of options that will, I think, make roster construction fun, but also challenging when you have this variety and this high potential outcomes in a lot of these games. So we wish you guys the best of luck there. Ben's write-up will be available for you guys to peruse. Now, Joe, it is that time of the evening. Yeah. It is time for Start Sit. Whenever you are ready, good sir, we are ready for you.
Yeah, guys. So look, here we are. We're in week 11, and in season long, we're in the playoffs. And like what Ben said last week, DFS, we're right in the thick of things. A lot of things have happened. We know what we're getting now. So you know what? We used to do the underperformer, overperformers, but we've got a few names on the start bench list, and we're going to get right into it, guys. We're not going to waste any time. A lot of money on the line and playoff hopes on line. So here we go. We're going to begin on the bench, guys, and we're going to start at the Indiana-Michigan game with quarterback Nate Sudfeld. He struggled last week in Indiana's 35-27 loss at home against Iowa. He only completed 43% of his passes. That was a season low. And you know what? I don't think this week things are going to get any easier when Michigan, the nation's #1 defense, comes to town. I'm calling for Nate Sudfeld, week 11 bench, home against Michigan. Dane Evans, you said his name would resurface, Ben. You had a feeling it would be on the start bench. We were suggested benching this guy a few weeks ago. It's the only good game he had in recent history. He's only top 30 fantasy points once in the last 6 games, and he's failed the top 20 fantasy points in 4 of the last 6 games. He's failed to reach 300 passing yards in 3 of the last 4, and he hasn't accounted for more than 2 touchdowns in a game 6 times this year. Dane Evans, guys, week 11 bench at Cincinnati. You mentioned how this game could be fun, Ben. SMU at Navy, right? Quarterback Matt Davis, SMU. He hasn't passed for more than 250 yards in a game since September, even though he's accounted for at least 3 touchdowns in 2 of SMU's previous 4 games. SMU has one of the nation's worst run defenses, so we're expecting Navy to be able to sustain long drives with quarterback Keenan Reynolds, running back Chris Swain, and limit the number of offensive opportunities that Davis and the offense is going to get on Saturday. We think Matt Davis is a smart bench this week at Navy. And you know what? Algie Brown, this game isn't on a slate, but we're going to touch on it real quick. Running back BYU at Missouri. He scored a touchdown in 4 consecutive games, but those were against East Carolina, Cincinnati, Wagner, and San Jose State. This week, BYU travels to Missouri, faces a top 25 run defense that's only given up 5 rushing touchdowns. For your season-long guys, Algie Brown, running back BYU, is a bench this week. We talked about those Mountain West games. We got running back Brian Hill, Wyoming at San Diego State. He's been solid all year. He's after topping 100 yards in 3 straight games. He's been held to less than 80 yards in 2 of the past 3 games. And this week, the Cowboys are traveling to San Diego State. They play the conference's best defense against the run. And the Aztecs are only allowing 107 yards per game, which ranks them in the top 10 of the FBS. Brian Hill, running back Wyoming, is a bench at San Diego State. And Jared Baker, the last bench of the night. Running back Arizona versus Utah. He's had difficulty finding traction on the ground. He's failed the top 70 rushing yards in each of the Wildcats' previous 3 games. This week, Arizona hosts Utah and the Pac-12's #1 rushing defense. The Utes are allowing fewer than 150 rushing yards per game. We're calling for Jared Baker, week 11 bench. Arizona playing home against Utah. And guys, we're going to go to the starts, right? We're going to start with the Oregon-Stanford game. This may not be more of a daily start, more of a season-long, guys. Vernon Adams, quarterback Oregon. He's accounted for at least 4 touchdowns in the past 2 games, and the Ducks travel to Stanford in week 11. And even though the Cardinals' defense is allowing only 20.2 points per game, they've given up at least 28 points in 3 conference games this year, guys. Fantasy owners may shy away from Adams because of the matchup, but in leagues that you start 2 quarterbacks, I think Adams is worth a quarterback's 2 spot in week 11. We're calling for you guys that play 2 quarterbacks. Vernon Adams is a start at Stanford this week. For your season-long guys, it's come a long way. Nebraska-Rutgers isn't on the daily slate this week, but, we usually don't include players that we have high ranked in our rankings every week in our start bench. But, we haven't ranked Armstrong this high all season long. We haven't ranked number 10 this week. And the junior quarterback has accounted for at least 3 touchdowns in 3 consecutive starts, including 4 rushing touchdowns. And this week, the Cornhuskers travel to Rutgers, where 2 of the nation's worst pass defenses, they're going to square off. We're calling for Tommy Armstrong, week 11 start, Nebraska at Rutgers. And here we go, guys. Deshaun Kaiser, quarterback Notre Dame, playing at Wake Forest. Kaiser and the Notre Dame offense, they've scored at least 40 points in 3 of the Irish's past 4 games. And the sophomore quarterback has accounted for 9 touchdowns in the past 2 games. Wake Forest has only given up 23 points per game, but the defense has struggled in recent weeks, guys. They've given up 35 or more in 2 of the past 3. Deshaun Kaiser, Will Fuller, they got the hookup. They've got it going now, guys. They've got the connection going. He's a week 11 start at Wake Forest. Ralph Webb, running back Vanderbilt. He's been solid the last 3 weeks against quality opponents. He ran for 99 yards in consecutive weeks against Missouri and Houston, 118 last week against Florida. Well, this week he faces a Kentucky defense that's given up nearly 200 yards on the game, 200 yards per game on the ground, and they've allowed 20 rushing touchdowns in 2015. That's worse than the SEC. Ralph Webb, get him in your lineup, guys. Playoff week, week 11 start versus Kentucky. And you know what? Kelvin Taylor, Florida running back at South Carolina. Taylor has only topped 100 rushing yards twice this season, but he has scored a touchdown in all but one of the Gators games this year. This week he faces the SEC's second worst rush defense, as the Gamecocks have given up over 200 yards per game on the ground. Get Kelvin Taylor in there, guys. Week 11 start at South Carolina. And 2 more names. And we're going to stay in the SEC. We're throwing out big names this week. There's playoffs on the line, money on the line, guys. We're not going small change. Big names here. Alex Collins, running back Arkansas at LSU. The LSU defense took a pounding on the ground last week at Alabama, and it's reasonable to suggest that Arkansas is going to incorporate a similar strategy when they travel to Baton Rouge this weekend. Collins has topped 100 yards in 7 of 9 games this year, and the junior back could be in line to get 20-plus carries in Week 11 as the Hogs try to catch the Tigers in a hangover game. Get Alex Collins in your lineup this week, Week 11 start at LSU. And here's a little bit of a surprise, guys. We're going against Alabama this week. Dak Prescott, quarterback, Mississippi State, at home versus Alabama. Prescott has been on a tear in recent weeks, guys. He's passed for at least 300 yards per game and has accounted for 14 touchdowns in the past 3 games. We know it's a dangerous proposition, suggesting to start Prescott against the Alabama defense, but the Tide have struggled at times against spread offenses. The Bulldogs may not have enough to spring the upset in Starkville this Saturday, but this may be Alabama's biggest hurdle remaining on their quest to earn one of the 4 college football playoff spots. Maybe Prescott is a little bit of a DFS question, but for you guys that can start 2 quarterbacks, get them in there this week. We think Mississippi State gives Alabama a scare at home. And that's your Week 11 start bench, guys. Good luck.
Week 11, as in-depth as every week before. Great stuff, Joe. I appreciate the work that has gone into that all season long. Now, Ben, we come to you to close out the night. Are you going further on your hot take, or are you settling for what you had earlier?
No, that wasn't a hot take. I got to do much better than that. Let's go with a very talented wide receiver who we talked about earlier as one of the must plays, and that's Artavis Scott. So Artavis Scott's 5,300 on FanDuel. My hot take is that he is the highest scoring wide receiver this week. And part of the reason why I'm coming to that conclusion is you're talking about a guy that gets a focused amount of targets, a lot of targets. He is one of those players that can disappear, and he did this last year as a freshman, but I always thought it was because of Mike Williams' presence. It's more because of Deshaun Watson than anything. And I'm interested to see this year him hit another one of those games. Like he had a game against Boston College this year where he had 10 catches for 162 yards and a touchdown. I'm not saying he bests those receptions numbers, but I'm going to say he's every bit as good and every bit as potent in the fantasy points category as that game. Syracuse is giving up 274 yards per game through the air, which is one of the worst numbers in their conference. 66.2% completion rate. Deshaun Watson should just utterly thrash them on the road. And I'm hoping that this game stays tight enough, which I think it will, just because they're playing on the road. It's just not one of those situations where you just automatically think blowout within the first, 5 minutes of the game. But I think you're going to see some big plays out of Scott that you haven't seen this season. He had some huge performances last year. I think that he's going to be the highest scoring, and that's my hot take.
I'll have him in my lineups, Ben. How about that? I'm with you on this one, and I'm gonna ride it through Saturday night, and I'll probably thank you for it then. So we will
cry together, buddy.
That works too. We will see Ben's article out on Fantasy Insiders tomorrow, the early and late slate. Later on, Joe, over at the CFF site, the start sit is released obviously on the show, but it's available over there as well, and all the rankings for each week as well. So, guys, Ben, Joe, great stuff as always. To you guys listening in pod form or on YouTube, wish you the best of luck. Find Fantasy Insiders on Twitter at Fantasy Insiders. And if you're not yet a member and you're not yet reading Ben's stuff, it's fantasyinsiders.com/plans, and you can find out how to become a member of Fantasy Insiders. So, best of luck on Saturday. We'll be back with you next week right here on the College Football Show, presented by fantasyinsiders.com.